The 18th and 19th centuries saw the rapid rise of cotton as one of the most valuable commodities in the world. It was often referred to as King Cotton because it dominated the economy of the southern United States and fueled the Industrial Revolution. However, this massive industry had a dark foundation: enslaved labor. When Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793, cotton production skyrocketed. This machine could separate seeds from cotton fibers faster than any human could, transforming cotton from a labor-intensive crop into a highly profitable one. But this increased productivity also created a higher demand for enslaved workers. Plantation owners needed more hands to plant, pick, and process cotton. By the early 1800s, a significant obstacle arose for slaveholders. The international slave trade had been outlawed in the United States in 1808, making it illegal to import enslaved people from Africa. Yet the demand for labor kept growing. Faced with this challenge, plantation owners turned to a horrifying solution: breeding enslaved people. Breeding farms became a systematic way to increase the enslaved population without relying on imports. Enslaved women, particularly those deemed strong and healthy, were forced into reproduction. Their children, born into slavery, became the next generation of unpaid laborers. In this way, slavery transformed from an exploitative labor system into a self-sustaining cycle of human commodification. These breeding farms were often operated as standalone facilities or attached to larger plantations. Enslaved men and women were paired together based on physical traits that plantation owners believed would produce the strongest offspring. This dehumanizing process turned reproduction into a business transaction. Children born on these farms were seen not as human beings, but as assets valued and traded like livestock. The brutality of this system cannot be overstated. Enslaved women had no choice in the matter. They were forced into pregnancies, often enduring the physical and emotional toll without any regard for their well-being. Their children were usually taken away and sold to other plantations, severing family bonds and perpetuating cycles of trauma. The breeding farms were a direct response to economic greed, born out of the plantation owners' desire to maintain their profits at any cost. These places exemplify the lengths to which the cotton industry went to sustain itself, a system built on the backs of human suffering, exploitation, and unimaginable cruelty. These were not farms in the traditional sense. They were facilities where enslaved people were forced into reproduction, with their bodies and lives controlled entirely by their owners. After the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in the U.S. in 1808, plantation owners faced a major problem: how to sustain their enslaved workforce. They turned to a horrifying solution: creating breeding farms where enslaved men and women were coerced into having children. Enslaved women were seen as breeders and were valued based on their fertility. Girls as young as 13 or 14 were forced into this system, often enduring pregnancy after pregnancy with no consideration for their health or well-being. Once they gave birth, their children were treated as property, often sold to other plantations before they even had a chance to know their mothers. Plantation owners developed strict methods to control reproduction. Enslaved men were often selected based on physical traits deemed desirable, such as strength or height, and paired with women to produce what owners saw as the ideal offspring. These pairings were not voluntary. Enslaved people had no agency in these decisions. They were forced into this practice under the constant threat of violence or death. For enslaved women, pregnancy was a time of unimaginable hardship. They were expected to continue working in the fields or performing manual labor throughout their pregnancies. There was no medical care provided, and the risk of complications was extremely high. Many women died during childbirth, but plantation owners saw this as an acceptable loss as long as enough children survived to increase their labor force. When children were born, they were seen as property from the moment they took their first breath. Their value was calculated in terms of how much they could eventually sell for or how much labor they would provide. These infants were not allowed the basic dignity of a childhood. They were commodities, bought and sold like cattle. Children born on breeding farms often faced a grim fate. Many were sold to other plantations as soon as they were old enough to work. Mothers and fathers were routinely separated from their children, destroying families without a second thought. This was intentional. Slaveholders believed that breaking family bonds made it easier to control enslaved people by isolating them from emotional support. At auctions, enslaved children were examined and priced like animals. Buyers would check their teeth, measure their height, and assess their physical health. These were children stripped of any humanity, treated as products to be marketed and sold. Despite these unimaginable conditions, many enslaved people resisted in any way they could. Some women tried to avoid pregnancy by hiding their fertility or using secret methods to prevent conception. Others tried to escape, risking their lives for a chance at freedom. These acts of resistance, though small in the grand scheme of things, were powerful expressions of humanity in a system designed to erase it. Some enslaved parents fought desperately to protect their children, even when the odds were stacked against them. Stories of mothers hiding their babies or attempting to flee with them are a testament to the resilience and strength of those trapped in this brutal system. The mechanics of breeding farms reveal the complete dehumanization of enslaved people. They were stripped of their identities, their autonomy, and even their ability to make choices about their own families. The sole purpose of these farms was to increase profits for plantation owners with no regard for the suffering inflicted on the individuals caught in this system. Breeding farms were not an anomaly. They were a calculated and systematic effort to sustain slavery in America. They represent one of the darkest aspects of human history, where greed and inhumanity overpowered morality and compassion. Life on a breeding farm was a nightmare from which there was no escape. Every moment of an enslaved person's life was controlled, monitored, and exploited for the benefit of their owners. These farms were not just places of forced labor, but of systematic abuse designed to break the spirit of those trapped there. Enslaved men, women, and even children were viewed solely as property. Families were deliberately separated, and enslaved people were often denied the ability to form lasting relationships. The constant fear of being sold or seeing a loved one sold loomed over every interaction. For children born on these farms, life began as a commodity. By the age of 5 or 6, they were often put to work or sold at auctions. Even in their earliest years, they were not spared from the brutality of slavery. The breeding farms were a cold, calculated business decision. With the end of the transatlantic slave trade, plantation owners saw forced reproduction as the most cost-effective way to sustain their labor force. Each child born into slavery was seen as an investment, a future laborer or a commodity to be sold. Slaveholders meticulously calculated the value of enslaved people based on their physical traits, age, and reproductive potential. Women of childbearing age were particularly prized as they were seen as the key to increasing profits. Men were valued for their physical strength and the perceived genetic traits they could pass on to their offspring. The sale of families became a significant source of income for some plantation owners. At auctions, enslaved individuals were inspected like livestock, their worth determined by factors like health, strength, and fertility. This commodification of human life was central to the economic success of the cotton industry. For enslaved men, the trauma came from being stripped of their agency and forced into roles that denied them the ability to protect or support their families. Children, too, were victims, robbed of their childhoods, and thrust into a system that treated them as tools for profit. Resistance took many forms. Some enslaved people risked everything to escape, while others fought back through subtle acts of defiance. Women sometimes used traditional methods to prevent pregnancies or refused to cooperate with the system in any way they could. These small acts of rebellion were acts of courage in a world designed to crush their spirits. The abolition movement gained momentum in the mid-19th century, fueled by the bravery of former enslaved individuals who shared their stories. Figures like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman exposed the horrors of slavery, galvanizing public opinion against the institution. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation marked the beginning of the end for slavery breeding farms. By the time the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, the brutal system of forced reproduction was dismantled. However, the scars it left behind remain a painful reminder of the human cost of greed and inhumanity.